The glass doors of Westbridge Financial opened quietly as Eleanor Winters stepped inside. She looked out of place. Her outfit was modest, a pale blue cardigan over a plain blouse, a long grey skirt, and sensible black shoes worn at the edges. Her short silver hair was neatly brushed, and a small beige purse hung from her shoulder. She walked with purpose, but to the polished professionals around her, she seemed like an elderly woman who had simply gotten lost. The lobby was immaculate. Marble floors gleamed under soft lighting, and the air carried the faint scent of designer cologne and fresh espresso. The gold letters on the wall behind the reception desk spelled out Westbridge Financial Corporate Headquarters. Eleanor approached the reception desk with quiet confidence. A young woman seated behind it looked up from her computer, blinking as she took in the older woman's appearance. "Good morning," Eleanor said politely. "I'm here to speak with someone about the ownership of this bank." The receptionist paused, eyebrows raised slightly. She was in her 20s, dressed in a sharp blazer with perfectly styled hair and long manicured nails. "I'm sorry, did you say ownership?" "Yes," Eleanor replied calmly. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding about the current ownership. I'd like to clear it up." A man standing nearby holding a tablet and wearing an expensive watch scoffed quietly. "She probably means her checking account," he whispered to the receptionist, not caring that Eleanor was close enough to hear. The receptionist's polite smile barely covered her confusion. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Eleanor said, her voice even. "But I believe this matter is urgent." The receptionist hesitated, then leaned toward the phone and pressed a button. She spoke in a hushed tone, her eyes flicking toward Eleanor more than once. After a short exchange, she hung up and forced a smile. "If you'd like to take a seat, someone will be with you shortly." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, and moved to one of the leather chairs by the tall windows. Whispers followed her. A few employees glanced up from their desks and smirked. "Lost her way to the senior centre," someone mumbled. Another said, "Maybe she's here to cash in war bonds." Eleanor sat calmly, folding her hands in her lap. She didn't react to the whispers. Instead, she looked around the lobby and took in the large oil painting of rolling hills hanging on the wall. It reminded her of a place she and her late husband once visited in the countryside. She waited patiently for 10, then 15 minutes. No one offered her water, no one checked on her. Finally, the receptionist stood and walked over with a forced smile. "Miss Winters? Mr. Langston, our regional office manager, can spare a few minutes for you." "Thank you," Eleanor said, rising to her feet. She followed the receptionist down a long hallway, past glass-walled offices filled with sleek furniture and executives in expensive suits. She could feel their eyes on her. They were already dismissing her without a word. That was fine. They didn't know who she really was. And they certainly didn't know what was coming next. Eleanor stepped into a sunlit office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a wall of framed certificates. Behind a glossy oak desk sat a man in his early 50s, clean-shaven, with sharp features and slicked-back hair. His suit was tailored, his tie symmetrical. He stood as the receptionist gestured toward the seat across from him. "This is Miss Winters," she said. "She wanted to speak about ownership." The man blinked once, then forced a tight smile. "Thank you, Jenna." Jenna left, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The man extended a hand across the desk. "Matthew Langston, Regional Office Manager. You had a question about account ownership?" Eleanor shook his hand lightly and sat down. "I'm not here about an account, Mr. Langston. I'm here to clarify a misunderstanding about the bank itself. Westbridge Financial was not meant to be on the market. My late husband left ownership instructions that I believe were overlooked or deliberately ignored." Matthew blinked again. He gave a short laugh, surprised. Then his tone shifted into practiced professionalism. "I see. You're referring to what? A trust? A holding company?" "No, direct ownership," Eleanor said simply. Matthew leaned back in his chair. His expression shifted from surprise to amusement, then something closer to polite disbelief. "I'm sorry, Miss Winters, but our bank is currently under final negotiations with a private equity firm for full acquisition. I'm not sure what misunderstanding you're referring to." Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. "My husband, Henry Winters, was the majority shareholder before he passed away. This envelope contains his amended will and the last notarized documents that place the controlling interest of Westbridge Financial in my hands." She laid the envelope gently on the desk. Matthew didn't reach for it. Instead, he gave a low chuckle. Miss Winters, with all due respect, that sounds highly unusual. I mean, this is $1 billion institution. I'm aware, Eleanor replied calmly. He tilted his head, eyebrows raised. Your husband, Henry Winters, you said? Was on the board, yes, a respected investor. But these matters aren't handled in casual visits by concerned widows. I assume you've spoken with an attorney. I have. Then you know this isn't how it works? If there was any validity to your claim, you would have gone through legal channels, not shown up here. Like this. He gestured lightly to her outfit. Eleanor looked down at her simple skirt and sweater. I came straight from volunteering at the food pantry. I didn't think changing clothes would matter more than telling the truth. Matthew smirked. This is a bank, not a church potluck, Miss Winters. Image matters. There was a knock at the door. A younger man in a slim grey suit poked his head in. Sorry to interrupt, sir. The buyers from Eastern Equity Group are arriving downstairs. Thank you, Derek. I'll be there shortly. The man left. Matthew turned back to Eleanor, folding his hands. Look, I don't want to be unkind, but we're talking about serious capital, large-scale management, regulatory oversight. This isn't something for someone who donates canned food. He pushed the envelope gently back toward her. Eleanor didn't move to pick it up. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice soft but firm. Miss Winters, I understand this must be difficult losing a husband, especially someone as accomplished as Henry. But ownership of a bank isn't something you just claim with a piece of paper and good intentions. She stood up slowly, gathering the envelope. I see. Matthew offered a tight smile. Thank you for stopping by. As she turned to leave, he added one last jab. Next time I'd recommend coming with a lawyer and maybe a briefcase. You know, just to be taken seriously. Eleanor paused at the door and looked over her shoulder. That won't be necessary. The people you're meeting with downstairs might not be the ones you finished the deal with. Matthew raised an eyebrow. She didn't explain. She just walked out of the room, still calm, still certain, because she knew the truth, and the truth was about to shake the entire foundation of Westbridge Financial. Eleanor stepped back into the sunlight, clutching the envelope to her chest. The world outside the bank bustled forward as usual, but inside her heart, old memories stirred. She had been quiet for so long. Years had passed since Henry's funeral, years filled with silence and sorrow. Not many knew what he had built behind the scenes. To everyone else, she was just the widow of a respected businessman, a gentle woman who baked for church events, sent thank-you notes by hand, and never raised her voice in a crowd. But behind her calm demeanor was the steel of a woman who had once stood beside a man with vision. Henry Winters had not been a man of loud wealth. He had invested wisely, avoided media attention, and quietly amassed a stake in what was now one of the most successful regional banks on the eastern coast. What many never realized was that while he held most shares in his name, he had always made one thing clear. Eleanor was not just his wife, she was his partner. And before he passed, he ensured that legacy would continue. The envelope in her hands was not just a symbol of ownership, it was a message. Henry's final act of faith in her. As Eleanor walked down the sidewalk, she passed the old bookstore they used to visit every Saturday. The display window still held a copy of his favorite biography, its spine worn with time. She stopped and smiled softly. They had talked for hours in that store, dreaming about retirement, about giving back, about building something that would outlive them both. And now someone wanted to take it, to sell it off to strangers, to erase his legacy without even asking a single question. She turned the corner and headed toward a small cafe. Inside, her longtime friend, Margaret, sat by the window, stirring her tea with the same distracted rhythm she always used when deep in thought. Eleanor entered, and Margaret looked up, her face immediately filling with concern. I heard, Margaret said before Eleanor could even sit down. That man at the bank, Matthew Langston? Cold as marble. What happened? Eleanor sat, placing the envelope on the table between them. He laughed, she said simply. Told me to come back with a lawyer and a better outfit. Margaret scoffed. Some people only understand respect when it comes in a tailored suit. Eleanor nodded. But I don't need a suit. I have the truth. Margaret leaned in. Are you going to fight this? Eleanor looked out the window. I never stopped. Margaret's eyes softened. Henry would be proud. I know, Eleanor whispered. They sipped their tea in silence for a moment before Margaret asked the question that had been weighing on her. Do you really want to keep the bank, Elle? All of it? Eleanor looked at the envelope again. I want to keep the promise. Margaret tilted her head. Henry asked me to protect it. He believed this bank still meant something to the people it served. It was never about power. It was about people, about trust, about roots. Margaret smiled. Then you're doing exactly what you were meant to do. As they left the cafe together, Eleanor's steps felt lighter. The world hadn't changed, but something inside her had. She wasn't just defending a claim, she was defending a legacy. And if Matthew Langston thought he had dismissed a powerless widow in a cardigan, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The next morning, Eleanor stood before her late husband's old filing cabinet. It hadn't been touched in years, still smelling faintly of cedar and ink. The metal handle felt colder than she expected. She opened the top drawer and ran her hand over the neatly labeled folders. She found what she was looking for in the section marked Personal Trust. Inside were legal documents Henry had signed in his final months. Among them, a notarized transfer of controlling shares of First Provident Bank to Eleanor Margaret Winters, executed 3 weeks before his passing. Her name was typed in bold. Clear, unmistakable. Henry hadn't left room for doubt. She closed the folder and placed it carefully into her leather handbag. Then she opened a second drawer. Hidden beneath tax records and policy forms was a small wooden box she hadn't noticed before. Inside was a single letter. My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means someone has dared to forget what you mean to this legacy. Let this remind you of the promise I made. You were always the foundation of everything I built. Now they'll see it too. Yours always. Henry, tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. There was no time. She had already made a copy of the documents and contacted her attorney, a woman named Clara Donnelly, who had worked with Henry for over a decade. By mid-morning, Eleanor stood once again at the tall glass doors of First Provident Bank. This time she wore a navy coat over a soft grey dress and carried a leather folio under her arm. Her silver hair was neatly pinned. She didn't want to hide who she was, but she came prepared. Inside the bank, Matthew Langston sat behind his large oak desk, surrounded by framed diplomas and awards. He barely looked up when his secretary said, Mrs. Winters is here again. With a sigh, he straightened his tie and forced a polite smile. Mrs. Winters, back so soon? Eleanor stepped into his office and laid the envelope on his desk. I believe we left off with you laughing. Matthew blinked. Excuse me. You dismissed my ownership claim yesterday. I suggest you take a moment to review what I brought. He hesitated, then slowly opened the envelope. As he read, his face began to pale. These are significant documents. They are legally binding, Eleanor corrected. Matthew looked up. Mrs. Winters, even if this is accurate, the board has already begun preparations to sell to Ridgewell Holdings. You cannot just walk in and halt the process. I'm not here to ask your permission. I'm informing you of your oversight. He pushed back in his chair, trying to gather his thoughts. This will cause delays, confusion, maybe even conflict within the board. Eleanor tilted her head. Then let it. You're serious about this? I gave Henry my word, he scoffed. You do understand what you're taking on, the legalities, the obligations, the politics. I've weathered worse than paperwork, Mr. Langston. And I have people who believe in this just as much as Henry did. For a moment he looked like he might argue further, but something in her expression silenced him. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. Before this goes any further, you have a choice to make. Either you work with me or you find yourself on the wrong side of history. And trust me, the history of this bank will remember what comes next. With that, she stepped out of the office, her heels echoing against the marble floor. Matthew sat frozen for several seconds before muttering to himself, What did I just awaken? He reached for his phone. Get legal, now! By the afternoon, the news had spread across the upper floors of First Provident Bank like a wildfire behind a velvet curtain. Quiet conversations broke out in glass offices and over designer coffee mugs. Executives huddled near windows, glancing nervously at the woman who had once been nothing more than a footnote in their former CEO's obituary. Now she was holding papers that could alter everything. Matthew Langston sat at the head of the long mahogany boardroom table. His tie loosened slightly, a rare departure from his usual sharp appearance. Around him, the board members of First Provident Bank whispered and muttered. This cannot be real, said Judith Monroe, the director of finance. Henry never mentioned anything like this to us. He never had to, said Clara Donnelly as she walked into the room, cool and poised. She carried her briefcase with both confidence and care, placing it on the polished table. It wasn't the board's business, this was his personal estate, and he executed it flawlessly. "Who are you?" barked one man from the far end. "Clara Donnelly, estate attorney. I handled all legal matters for Mr. Winters during the last 8 years of his life." "And you're saying this transfer of controlling shares to his wife is legitimate?" "It's not just legitimate," Clara replied. "It's binding. And unless this board wants to spend the next 2 years tangled in court, I suggest we stop pretending otherwise." Someone scoffed. "But she doesn't have experience in leadership." "She has more experience in dignity and loyalty than some of you have in finance," Clara snapped. Silence followed. No one challenged her. Meanwhile, downstairs, Eleanor sat quietly in the very same waiting area that had once made her feel invisible. The receptionist looked up every few minutes, uncertain whether she should offer anything more than her awkward smile. A young intern walked past, paused, then doubled back. "Mrs. Winters?" Eleanor looked up. I just wanted to say my father started this internship program. He always told me about how Mr. Winters treated every employee like family. It's kind of amazing what you're doing." Eleanor gave a gentle smile. "Thank you, dear. Your father sounds like someone who understood what Henry believed." The young man nodded and quickly walked off, face flushed. Just then, Clara emerged from the boardroom upstairs, her eyes scanning the lobby until they found Eleanor. She offered a nod, and Eleanor stood. They met halfway at the base of the staircase. "Well?" Eleanor asked. "They're rattled, but the paperwork is rock solid. We've bought ourselves time." "How much?" "A few days, maybe a week before Ridgewell Holdings gets word." Eleanor nodded. "That's enough. I know what to do." Clara raised a brow. "Do you?" Eleanor's gaze swept across the bank lobby. She saw the tellers, the elderly couple trying to navigate the ATM, the mother explaining banking terms to her teenage daughter in line. "I've watched this place long before any of them noticed me," she said. "I saw Henry build it from the ground up. I helped him pick out the blueprints for the very walls they sit in. No one values this place more than I do, and I won't let it be sold to vultures." Clara gave a small smile. "Then let's get to work." That night, a special email was sent out to every department. An emergency staff meeting had been scheduled for the following afternoon. No details were shared, only that attendance was mandatory. And upstairs, behind the glass walls of the boardroom, the same executives who had laughed only hours earlier now sat in stiff silence, reviewing the signed documents that proved Eleanor Winters was no longer just the widow of their founder. She was the majority shareholder, and she had just declared her intent to protect the legacy they thought they controlled. The following afternoon, the atmosphere inside First Provident Bank was nothing like a typical Thursday. Employees whispered in hushed tones near water coolers, emails slowed, phones rang unanswered for just a few seconds longer than usual. Something was shifting, and everyone could feel it. At precisely 3 p.m., the staff assembled in the main conference hall on the 5th floor. It was a rarely used space reserved for shareholder meetings or year-end briefings, but today it had been cleared and prepared for something far more personal. Rows of chairs faced the front where a simple podium stood beneath a large bank logo. Normally, the executives would speak here, projecting numbers and projections with polished confidence. Today, however, there was no slideshow, no press release, no catering, just Eleanor. She stood at the front, not in morning black, not in casual attire, but in a navy blue dress Henry once loved on her. Her posture was upright, calm but firm. A small gold locket hung at her neck. She carried no notes. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her. As the last of the employees filed in, the room settled into silence. "Good afternoon," Eleanor began, her voice clear, though softened by age and emotion. "Thank you all for coming. I know many of you are wondering why we're here." She let that settle. Dozens of eyes stared up at her, some curious, some skeptical, a few already respectful. "I won't keep you long," she said, "but I owe you all the truth." Eleanor stepped slightly forward. "For many years I stood in the background of this institution. I was Henry Winters' wife, his partner and his quiet supporter. I was not in the meetings, I did not sign the deals, but I was there when this bank was nothing more than a desk in a rented office." A few older staff members nodded, they remembered. "I watched my husband build First Provident Bank from an idea into a legacy. I watched him help this community during its hardest years, offering loans when other banks turned people away. He believed that a bank should serve people, not just balance sheets. Her gaze swept the room. No one looked away. And now I stand before you not just as his widow, but as the legal majority shareholder of this institution. A soft murmur moved through the crowd. Yes, she said, confirming it. Henry left me ownership, quietly, intentionally, because he knew what was coming. He knew others would try to buy this place for parts. He knew they would ignore the people who built it. She took a breath. I was dismissed yesterday, mocked, told to take a financial literacy class. I was judged because I wore simple clothes and walked in alone, but I left with more than just insult. I left with clarity. Her voice grew stronger now. This bank will not be sold to Ridgewell Holdings, not while I have breath to stop it, and I do not intend to run things from behind the curtain anymore. I will be stepping into an active leadership role as chair of the board, effective immediately. There was silence, a few audible gasps, but no one spoke. I'm not here to replace anyone unfairly. I'm not here to clean house, but I am here to make sure that every customer is treated with respect, that every staff member is valued, and that Henry's vision is honored. She paused, then smiled. Some of you know me. Most of you don't. That will change. I plan to meet with every department over the next few weeks. I want to listen. I want to understand what you see, what you need, what this bank means to you. A young teller in the third row blinked rapidly, her eyes glistening. Eleanor nodded toward her. If we're going to face the future, we need to remember where we came from. This bank is not a brand, it is people. And people deserve to be seen. With that, she stepped back from the podium. There was no applause at first, but then slowly one person clapped, then another and another, until the room filled with the sound of hands coming together, not because they were told to, but because they believed. Eleanor had not just inherited a bank, she had claimed her voice. News travels fast in small towns, especially when it involves something as unexpected as a widow reclaiming control of a major financial institution. By Friday morning, local media outlets had picked up the story. Headlines buzzed with curiosity. Widow blocks multi-million-dollar bank sale. Who is Eleanor Winters? First Providence quiet matriarch speaks out. Customers trickled into the branch as usual, but this time their eyes held a different kind of awareness. The security guard offered Eleanor a respectful nod. Tellers greeted her warmly. Even the assistant manager stood up straighter as she walked past. It was clear something had shifted. Later that afternoon, Eleanor received a call from City Hall. The mayor himself wanted to meet. They arranged a press conference in front of the bank steps. Nothing grand, no red carpets or podiums draped in banners, just Eleanor, a microphone and a handful of reporters. The sun hung low in the sky when the gathering began. A light breeze stirred as people gathered around the modest press setup. Local business owners, retirees, students and curious residents stood behind the cameras, drawn not by spectacle but by something deeper. Eleanor stepped up to the microphone with quiet grace. I didn't ask for attention, she began, and I didn't expect this moment, but I also didn't expect to be treated like a stranger in a place my husband and I helped build. Her voice remained steady, each word chosen with care. 2 days ago, I walked into this bank wearing the clothes I wear every day. I asked a simple question about ownership and was laughed at. I was told I didn't belong, and I might have left it at that. She looked out over the crowd. But then I remembered what this place meant to Henry, what it still means to the people of this town. A pause, then she continued. My husband believed that dignity wasn't something you had to earn. It was something you deserved by simply being human. And yesterday, when I stood in front of the staff and told them who I was, I realized that I had a choice. The crowd leaned in. I could sell this place for profit, or I could protect it for purpose. A soft murmur of approval rose from those gathered. I chose purpose because I believe that banks are not just about interest rates or balance sheets, they are about trust. And I intend to earn yours, not with headlines, but with actions. She turned slightly toward the reporters. Let me make it clear. First Provident Bank is no longer for sale. The deal is cancelled, the board has been restructured, and starting next week we are launching new programs focused on community reinvestment, small business support and senior services. The cameras flashed. And to those who mocked me, I have no anger left, only hope that they too will one day understand the power of kindness over image, of presence over pretense. Someone in the crowd clapped. Then another, then the applause grew. Not loud, but heartfelt, real. An older man stepped forward. "Mrs. Winters," he said, "you approved my father's first loan in 1964. He built our bakery with that money. We're still in business today because of this place." Eleanor smiled. "Then let's keep building." The mayor approached, offering her a plaque of appreciation from the city. But it was the tearful hug from a young woman in the front row that moved her most. "You don't remember me," the girl said, "but my mum worked here until she passed. You sent flowers, you checked on us. I just wanted to say thank you." Eleanor blinked back emotion. "Of course I remember." As the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor remained for a moment, looking up at the sign above the bank doors. The same gold lettering, the same building. But now, a different chapter. She had been dismissed, mocked, undermined. But in standing tall, she had reminded an entire town that leadership does not come from suits or speeches. It comes from remembering who you are, and never forgetting who you're here to serve. Eleanor returned home that evening to find a familiar envelope waiting on the table. It had been forwarded from her old P.O. box, the one Henry used for decades. Her breath caught when she saw his handwriting. It was dated 6 months before his passing. She carefully opened it and unfolded the letter. "My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, it means something in your heart told you to walk into that bank again. Good. You were always braver than me when it came to standing alone. I know how they'll treat you. I saw it my whole life. The world looks at women like you and sees a retired grandmother, not the lion you are, but I see you. I always did. That's why I made sure the shares transferred in your name. Not because you needed money, but because you needed to remember who you are. You are not my widow. You are my legacy. If the time ever comes when people forget what this place stands for, I hope you'll remind them not with threats or power, but with that unshakable truth in your soul. Love always." Henry. Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. For a long time she just stood there, letting the quiet fill the room. It wasn't grief she felt now, it was something else. Closure and a new beginning. The next morning she arrived at the bank earlier than usual. A small crowd had already gathered outside, not reporters this time, not executives, just people, regular folks, Mrs. Henderson with her cane. The young single mother from down the street, the high school teacher who had been denied a car loan last year. They all stood together, uncertain at first, then forming a line as Eleanor unlocked the doors. Inside, the atmosphere was different. The tension had lifted. The receptionist offered a nervous smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Winters." Eleanor smiled back. "Good morning, dear. You can call me Eleanor." She walked to the main floor where the staff had gathered. They looked at her with quiet curiosity. "I know many of you had questions," she said. "Some of you didn't like how things played out. That's fair." No one interrupted. "I'm not here to fire anyone, but I am here to change the culture. Starting today, we treat every customer with dignity, not because they're wealthy or connected or wearing the right shoes, but because they deserve it." A few employees nodded. "Those who can't accept that are free to move on. Those who stay will be part of something better." There was a pause. Then a hand went up. It was Nancy Winters, the long-time teller. "Mrs. Winters, we've needed someone like you for a long time." Eleanor smiled gently. "Then let's get to work." She spent the rest of the morning walking the floor, learning names, asking questions, not barking orders, just listening. The staff seemed taken aback at first, then slowly they responded. By lunchtime, the breakroom chatter was lighter. The air felt breathable. Outside, a few customers lingered, sharing stories. The bakery owner dropped off a basket of fresh bread. A little girl handed Eleanor a drawing of the bank with hearts around it. She pinned it to the corkboard near the door. By the end of the week, new signs had gone up across the branch. Not corporate slogans, real words. Community first, everyone matters here. Come as you are. Eleanor sat in Henry's old office late that Friday afternoon. She looked around at the dusty photo frames, the brass desk lamp, the leather chair he used to sit in. She didn't change the furniture. She didn't need to. Everything that needed changing had already begun. And as she sipped her tea and looked out at the street below, she felt something unexpected. Hope. Not just for herself, but for the town. For everyone who had ever been told they were less than. For everyone who had ever walked into a place and been looked down on. Eleanor had come full circle, not because she wanted power, but because she remembered what real power looked like. It was the power of showing up, the power of speaking calmly when others shout, the power of walking into a room full of suits with your head held high and your heart intact. And above all, it was the power of being underestimated, because when they laughed, they had no idea who they were laughing at, and now they never would again. The following month marked a quiet revolution at the Oak Hollow Bank. Though the name on the sign remained the same, the spirit of the place was transforming. Eleanor didn't replace everyone. She didn't need to. A few resigned quietly, unable to adjust to the new expectations, but most stayed, grateful for a second chance to be part of something meaningful. Customers began noticing the difference. Gone were the stiff greetings and indifferent stares. In their place were warm smiles, respectful tones, and the kind of patient service that felt like stepping back into a better time. The elderly couple who had once been ignored now had a teller who helped them sort their bills line by line. The teenage boy who had been mocked for asking about a small savings account was now greeted by name. The local coffee shop was given a microloan to expand seating, based not just on projections but trust. And in the corner office, once occupied by cold ambition, now sat a widow with silver hair and steady hands, writing thank-you notes to long-time clients and taking calls from young entrepreneurs with big dreams. But Eleanor's greatest change came not from bank policy, but from a single choice she made one rainy afternoon. A woman named Emily walked through the doors, holding the hand of a small boy. She looked tired, soaked from the downpour, her sweater frayed at the sleeves. I came to talk to someone about opening a small account, she said softly. Eleanor stood up from behind her desk. She recognized the voice before she recognized the face. Emily, the waitress from the cafe, the one with the necklace, the one who had given her a napkin when no one else offered a kind word. And now here she was again, this time in need. Eleanor didn't hesitate. Come sit with me, she said gently. Emily hesitated, clearly unsure. I don't have much, just some tips and what's left from the last paycheck. Eleanor smiled. That's more than enough to start. They sat in her office, the boy colouring quietly in the corner while Emily explained her situation, recently moved to town. Working part-time, saving for a GED and a better life for her son. Eleanor listened without judgment, and then, after a long pause, she asked the question that had been echoing in her mind since that day in the cafe. Your necklace, she said. The one you always wear. May I ask where you got it? Emily touched the chain, startled. My husband gave it to me, she said softly. He passed away overseas, military, Ukraine. Eleanor felt her breath catch. What was his name? She asked, though her heart already knew. Thomas, Emily whispered. Thomas Winters. The room went silent. Eleanor reached for the drawer in her desk and pulled out an old photo, a young man in uniform, smiling. The same eyes as the boy now sleeping in the corner chair. She turned it toward Emily. Emily gasped. Where did you get this? Eleanor's voice trembled. He was my son. Tears welled in both women's eyes. For a moment neither spoke, and then like a thread being pulled tight between two broken pieces of cloth, something unspoken stitched itself into place. They sat there for a long time, hand in hand. I never knew he had family here, Emily said finally. He always talked about coming back and introducing us. He did, Eleanor whispered. He brought you here in his stories. Emily nodded, tears slipping down her cheek. He would have loved to see this, what you've done. Eleanor squeezed her hand. He's seeing it through you, through your son. That day, Emily didn't just open a savings account. She opened the next chapter in both their lives. Eleanor gave her a job at the bank, part-time to start. Emily's quiet strength quickly earned her respect, and within weeks she became a vital part of the team. Customers adored her, colleagues admired her. And the little boy with Thomas's eyes came to visit after school, running through the marble floors like they were his playground. Eleanor watched him one afternoon and smiled. She saw her son in that child, not just in appearance but in spirit. And she knew then that what she and Henry had built, what Thomas had given his life to protect, and what Emily had carried forward in quiet resilience. It was all still here, living, breathing, and moving forward, just like legacy is supposed to. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Eleanor. The quiet woman who had once been brushed aside like an inconvenience had now become the talk of the city. News of what had happened inside the bank spread quickly, from whispers in coffee shops to bold headlines in local papers. People who had once ignored her now looked at her with newfound respect, some even with awe. Eleanor, however, remained unchanged. She still walked to the florist every Friday, still greeted the neighborhood children with soft candies in her pocket, and still stopped by the war memorial every Sunday to sit quietly beside her son's engraved name. But there was something new in her eyes now. A softness, yes, but also a fire. The kind of fire only a person who had been silenced too long could carry without anger. She hadn't wanted revenge. What she wanted was truth, dignity, and a place where her son's legacy would not be used as a convenient excuse, but honored for the strength it truly held. The board of the bank, now fully aware of the late Henry Whitmore's ownership and his ironclad posthumous instructions, had little choice but to comply. The chairman personally called Eleanor to issue a formal apology. Not through an assistant, not through a letter, he called her himself. She answered with grace. "I appreciate your words," she said. "But if you want to make it right, change how you see people who walk through your doors. Not just me, everyone." He agreed. The bank would not only remain independent, as Henry had wished, but it would now launch a foundation in her son's name, the Thomas Whitmore Veterans Scholarship Fund, designed to help returning soldiers transition back into civilian life with education, housing, and job opportunities. When the announcement was made, Eleanor was asked to cut the ribbon. She wore the same necklace that had sparked it all. In the crowd stood Emily and her young son, whose eyes were wide and curious. Eleanor caught his gaze and smiled. After the ceremony, she knelt down to greet him properly. "Your father," she said, her voice catching just slightly, "was the bravest man I ever knew." The boy didn't speak, just nodded, clutching Emily's hand tightly. Emily stepped forward, her eyes glistening. "I didn't know if I should come today. After everything," she whispered. Eleanor stood and took her hand. "You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever," she said. "Family." They embraced again, this time with no tension, no uncertainty, just understanding. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her living room, watching the sun set from the window her husband had once installed with his own hands. She looked at the walls still adorned with photographs of a young man in uniform, a younger woman in love, and a family once whole. She didn't cry, not this time. Instead, she smiled. She picked up her pen and wrote a letter, not to the bank, not to the newspapers, but to Thomas. "My dear boy, today I watched a building filled with men and women finally see you as I always have. Not just a name on a plaque, not just a soldier, but a son, a father, a hero. And I saw your wife, your child, our child, stand with me. They carry your name, your kindness, and I carry your love. I miss you, but I'm no longer alone. With love, Mom." Outside, the lights of the city glowed softly, a heartbeat of hope in a world that still needed reminders. Reminders that strength doesn't always wear suits, that courage doesn't always come in noise, and that sometimes the most powerful people in a room are the ones no one sees coming.